Hi everyone, thank you so much for joining us for this week's Webinar Wednesday. My name is Stephanie Fox from the Network One, and I will be introducing our speaker and moderating the webinar. We also have Lizzie Gold and Paul Squirrel on the call, who some of you may know, so they are on hand to help if there's anything you need help with. So I'm just going to go through a little bit of housekeeping first. Timings wise, I will now give an introduction for about 5 minutes. Excuse me. Then our speaker will talk for 35 minutes. At the end, we'll have a 15-minute Q&A, and we are aiming to finish by 1:55 London time, so you can be ready for your next appointment. Please keep your microphones muted at all times, otherwise it will really interfere with the speaker. If we're calling you to ask a question, we'll unmute your microphone. That being said, if you could keep your videos on, we'd really appreciate it, so that our speaker has some friendly faces to present to. As I mentioned before, we'll have a Q&A portion right at the end, but if you have any questions in the meantime, just send them to me directly in the chat. So you can go to your chat box, and where it says to, you should see a drop-down menu. So instead of everyone, just select Stephanie Fox. Once I've got all the questions, I will go through them, and I'll select a few to ask Matilda once she has finished speaking. If you would like to ask the question yourself, just say something like "I'll ask" next to your question in the chat box, or if you prefer for me to ask, if you're feeling a little bit shy, that's fine as well, but just say so in the chat box. You should hopefully have your Zoom viewing mode set to speaker view, which means there should be one big box with the speaker. If not, you can just click speaker view at the top right of your screen. Our speaker will be sharing slides on her screen, so if you can't see her speaker window when her slides are on the screen, just select Show Active Speaker Video. If you have any technical issues, please message Lizzie Gold directly in the chat, or you can email Lizzie at lizzie.gold, G-O-L-D, @thenetwork1.com. We are currently recording this webinar, so if you prefer not to take notes and just listen and engage, that's totally fine. We'll send around the recording afterwards. And if for any reason the system crashes, just wait a couple of minutes and you can log back in via the same link that you used to log in this afternoon. Thank you very much. Now I'm pleased to introduce our speaker, Dr. Matilda Andersson. Dr. Matilda Andersson is Managing Director of CrowdDNA's London and Amsterdam offices, with responsibility for the best team of trend specialists, researchers, strategists, semioticians, social media analysts, designers, writers, and filmmakers out there. Since joining in 2015, Matilda has delivered work that's disrupted categories, brought products to market, inspired creative directions, and communicated powerful narratives for the world's most exciting brands. Thanks to a never-stop learning philosophy, she's completed 2 masters and a PhD in media and communication. Today, Matilda will teach us CrowdDNA's culturally charged version of scenario planning and how it guides their clients to exciting and credible results. Without further ado, I'm very pleased to turn over to Dr. Matilda Andersson.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for tuning in today. And thank you to Network One for inviting me. I'm really excited to be here, and it's great to see so many friendly faces. I've been delivering quite a few webinars where I haven't been able to see people. So this is a really refreshing session, being able to see some of you. So really nice to be here. I'm going to be sharing my screen and start the presentation. There we go. So today I'm going to be covering what we mean by scenario planning at CrowdDNA, what makes it culturally charged, and why it's important, and how it can really help us navigate through times of uncertainty that we're living through at the moment. We're going to be using and applying the framework to the area of the home, and look at a little bit more detail around the in-home experience to help us illustrate how scenario planning works from our point of view. So, structure of the presentation today, we're going to talk about usual fears and debunk some myths around scenario planning. We're going to talk through the process. We're going to look at the example of the in-home experience, talk about how we craft a strategy, and then you have the opportunity to ask me some questions. So before I start, just a few basics about crowd DNA, so you know from what point of view I'm talking. And there's also a very silly picture of me there. When the first time I talked about scenario planning and used the in-home experience as an example, I shared what's been going on for me in my home lately. And I, for the first time, acquired some indoor plants that I'm looking at there very proudly. I've never been able to keep any plants alive ever before in my life. So it's a bit of a joke amongst my friends and family, but I've actually made a real effort this time, and that's made a difference for me. So Crowd DNA. We're a culture, insight and strategy agency, and hopefully that will become clear what we mean by that as I talk through how we work with scenario planning. We have 5 global offices. We started in London 12 years ago, and since then we've also got offices in Amsterdam, New York, Singapore and Sydney. There's 50 of us, and as Stephanie mentioned in our bio, we have lots of different capabilities at Crowd DNA. We blend traditional research and qualitative and quantitative methods with trend specialism, strategy, semiotics, social media listening, and through to designers, writers and filmmakers to put together the perfect team with blended skills to deliver culturally charged commercial advantage to our clients. We're incredibly global in the work we do. We're active in 60 different markets, and we really pride ourselves in being able to understand people all around the world and turn that into local and culturally relevant strategies all over the world. So we work with lots of recruitment partners who can help us find the right participants around the world. And we also work really hard on the authenticity of what comes out of the work. So we've had an incredible response from working and running scenario planning projects over the years, and increased interest in the last few months. I'm going to talk you through how we work with culturally charged scenario planning. But first, there are a few myths and fears around scenario planning that I thought would just be useful to go through. Perhaps we can debunk some myths around scenario planning. So first one, you can't predict the future. It's not possible. It's not a robust methodology, or it's just hedging your bets and avoiding strategy. So, can we predict the future? No, not one single future, because we don't have a crystal ball. There's not a hard, fast way of knowing exactly what's going to happen in the future. And I've actually put this week's weather forecast on the slide. And it's not just because here in London we're absolutely obsessed by knowing the weather and predicting the weather. It's to illustrate that we work with a lot of predictive data that isn't perfectly accurate or is 100% going to tell us what's happening in the future, but we use it anyway for planning purposes. So if you think about it and really kind of start thinking about what data you use, there's lots of predictive techniques that you will be familiar with. And as an organization, a brand, if you want to understand and look beyond the next 18 months, the only real process or way of doing that in a robust way is really scenario planning. And it's not about predicting one future, it's about looking at multiple possible futures, different scenarios that you can start building into a limited number of options for a strategy. And the reason why that's important is because most people and organizations suffer from future blindness. It's actually really difficult as a human being to think outside our immediate reality. We're not really programmed in that way. So we need a way to force ourselves out of our everyday to think about the future. And actually, the pandemic has been quite good it's a good moment to start planning for the future, because we are actually able to remove ourselves a little bit from the biases around what we already know, because our everyday has been disrupted. So scenario planning is all about removing biases and focus on those things that we may not have wanted to think about, or the opportunities that we couldn't see without this process. Another usual fear is that scenario planning is just science fiction. And we can assure you that it's not. The reason why we're so fond of scenario planning at CrowdDNA is not only that it helps us build strategy, but as a method, it's the perfect combination of creativity, narrative creation, and systematic, rigorous research. Lots and lots of research. So very left and right brain combined, which is what you need to be able to take leaps into the future. And scenario planning actually originates from military strategy and the world of think tanks. Herman Kahn, a military strategist, controversially created scenarios around what will happen in terms of, in the case of nuclear disaster, but also then predictions around everything to do with the human condition. And he also developed this technique that is very associated with scenario planning, where you talk about the future from the point of view of people who are already in the future. So told from a person who's living that future. And to make scenario planning robust, we look at lots and lots of research and use techniques like pestle factors, mega and macro trends, need states, behavioral economics, plotting shifts in cultural orthodoxy. And so we're not starting from scratch. All that information that we've built up from studying the human condition over years and years goes into scenario planning. And actually, values and motivations are fairly stable, even if the manifestations of those needs and motivations might differ. There's a lot of what we can learn from how we've responded to crisis in the past, but also really understanding values and motivations. And when the crisis hit, actually finding information isn't the problem. As you might have noticed from the last few months, there's been lots of information around how, trends, how we're changing, how behavior is changing. But what's really difficult, and where you have to find the time and spend the time, is around navigating, evaluating, and decipher what that means for the future of the client that you're working with, for the brands that you're working with. Other usual criticism is that crafting multiple scenarios is just hedging your bets and not having to make decisions. That's not really the case. That just means that you haven't kind of taken the method as far as it can go. Brands that systematically work with scenario planning to not only capture, but to help define the zeitgeist are brands that are successful. Pivoting is nothing new. Shell actually started off selling actual shells. Netflix was a mail delivery service, and Play-Doh was post-depression era wall cleaner. And what those brands have in common is that they responded to the future before it was too late. But at the same time, we also have many companies that have been around for 100 years that are at the moment are going out of business. Lots of high street retailers, brands that haven't been able to respond to the future and act on time. So scenario planning is about thriving and planning for change, but that means that you have to make a decision, you have to act against the scenarios. So a quick look at how it works. So 4 stages. We track forces of change, so all that research then goes into pinpoint critical uncertainties, 2 critical uncertainties. Then we develop and ideate probability scenarios, and then we craft a strategy. So at CrowdDNA, when we track forces of change, we start with culture. We literally pour culture into our scenario planning. What are the macro and micro forces at play? How are values changing? What seeds or signs of new behaviors can we spot through ethnographic data. And we typically look at leading edge participants so we can get that future perspective, so people who are at the forefront of change. When we look at culture, we look at both fast culture and slow culture. So fast culture is more music, food, fashion, lifestyle trends, and slow culture is more values, norms, could be to do with work, family, and even spirituality. We start with workshops to agree on the focus, and then we edit down and we edit down until we've found the signs that are the most pertinent and useful for us to look at for the brief that we're working on. Now it's time to pick the 2 most critical uncertainties to build a matrix. What are the 2 drivers or tensions from your research that will have the biggest impact on the future for your client? Is it the extent of AI adoption? Or is it a value shift? Is it the extent to which people value certainty and safety versus discovery and adventure? It depends on what you're focusing on. Be ruthless. Only pick 2 critical uncertainties to build a matrix. I've seen a lot of researchers and strategists coming with a wheel with lots of axes, or building lots and lots of different matrices, but it's not going to help you make decisions in the end. So try to be ruthless at this stage. The matrix then creates tensions that are fertile ground to ideate scenarios against. And obviously these territories that sits between the quadrants are informed by all of the research that you've done. And again, don't try to ideate too many scenarios. They can be more than 4, but too many just means that they're probably likely to overlap. And try to tell the story of your scenario as if it's already happened. So what's happening in the future? What does the competition look like? What's the cultural articulation of these scenarios? That's a way of just kind of really see that it's a scenario and not just a trend. And then, of course, it's all about crafting a strategy. So create the narrative that will populate each square, thoughtful, empathetic storytelling, strong naming principles of your scenarios is advice, and make sure that everyone you work with, clients, stakeholders, that they can imagine their way through every dimension of the scenario. And then workshop it. Make sure that you look at what it means for your audience strategy, your brand strategy, your marketing strategy, your project strategy, so that you can really get a picture of how you can play within the different scenarios. So the whole process takes a lot of ruthlessness and discipline. It's a military strategy, after all. And that particularly comes when you come to actually defining the scope. So, and this is so cliche, and all of you know this, but what you get out really is only as good as you put in when it comes to scenario planning. So to make scenario planning actionable and meaningful, you need to really define the question. And for the purpose of just illustrating this process, we picked the in-home experience for obvious reasons. A lot of us around the world have spent an awful lot of time in home, and also brands have really responded to the challenge of entertaining and feeding us and providing services in the home. So it's an interesting area going through a lot of change. So let's apply the model, the framework, to the area of the home. But before we look ahead, let's just do a little bit of a history tour to see how the home has changed in response to crisis in the past. So the Black Death in Europe led to the creation of private chambers, so social distancing within the home. And obviously we've opened homes up, open plan solutions, but are we going back to more private spaces again? The tuberculosis epidemic in the beginning of the last century and the sanatoriums inspired modernist architecture, open structures, the balconies, big windows. And while owning became more challenging post the 2008 recession, personalizing space and making your own space comfortable became incredibly aspirational. So lifestyle and home decoration became incredibly strong. More recent environmental disasters like earthquake in Japan, bushfires in Australia have led to a new wave of architecture where we're building structures that look soft but are incredibly strong. And that's an interesting, really interesting development. So lots of things have changed in our homes in past crises. So now let's look at the future. So what we mean by signs is the kind of early signs that there's a big cultural shift going on. You usually have lots of signs from a process like this, and we've chosen just to look at 4 to see as an example. So what we can see in the home, renew empathy for people and planet. So this is a sign about a desire to give back and rebalance power in our community. It was already there before COVID, but lockdown, how the pandemic has hit, has highlighted privilege, shown how unequal society can be. And it's inspired a flurry of apps and services that are trying to redistribute resources within community. So we've obviously had protests and Black Lives Matters and lots of movements around rebalancing power. And of course, some of you might think, yeah, I can totally see this. Others might think, oh, actually it's the opposite. And every sign always has a counter sign, so bear that in mind. Then we have micro-localism, that desire for collectivism combined with safety and reassurance. So obviously shop small, support small businesses was already there before the pandemic, but it's really kind of exploded in the last few months, and it's about emotionally and financially supporting your own. Local restaurants, how they sell ingredients directly to consumers, local pubs delivering, not just in the UK, all over the world. And local councils starting support systems, and even to a certain extent, everything where we're really kind of focusing on local and supporting the local community. And this might sound really utopian, but I think it's also about reinforcing and establishing norms around protectionism and protecting ourselves from the other. So it's also quite isolating. It's us versus them. The third sign is around protection and individualism. So how we prioritize safety to kind of insulate ourselves from a toxic, harmful modern world. Touchless taps, kind of skincare products that are protecting us against toxins in the environment, air purification and clean air. And lots of these are already very popular in China particularly. And fourth sign is in-home creative, the in-home creative revolution that we've seen during the pandemic. And to a certain extent, it was also there. It's just been accelerated, really. So crafternoons, creative kitchen escapades, and then, of course, gaming and streaming and all the kind of appliances and tech that we're using to keep ourselves entertained in the home that has just been amplified in the last few months. So those are signs, and then it's all about taking all of the data, all of the signs that you have, all of the drivers, and find those 2 critical uncertainties. So here it's about bringing yourself back to the objective. What are you really? What are the critical uncertainties for the future of the category you're looking at, the brand, the client? And for the future of the home, it became pretty clear to us for what we were looking at, that the first critical uncertainty is the emotional tension between protection and freedom. So when it comes to the future role of the home, will people long-term prioritize freedom, creativity, and release, or look for reassurance, stability, and security? And the second critical uncertainty is the social battle between me and we. So when it comes to the future of the home, will people seek to champion the personal and individual, or strive to embrace collectivism and belonging? So then we plotted that on our matrix. So the y-axis we have our emotional tension, and the x-axis is our social tension, so collectivism and individualism. And then we can start building out our scenarios. So how does this then play out? So this is where we ideate scenarios against those tensions, the different sections of the matrix. And you can definitely have more than one. For the purpose of illustration, we've given you 4 examples of scenarios. So scenario 1 sits between freedom and collectivism, community rebellion, which is all about a radical reinvention of public and private space. Scenario 2, closed communities. So that's more anchored in tribalism, where we create insular, protected communities. In scenario 3, the home has become the home bunker, where social distancing has become a design paradigm. Scenario 4 is all about maximalism, where we increasingly embrace in-home indulgence and hedonism. So just a little bit more detail on those scenarios, what might be happening there. So if we look into the community rebellion, is this a world where we can move from home ownership to community membership? Are we moving away from homes as assets or investment, and instead ownership becomes a right? What if police forces were defunded? What if streets were pedestrianized? What if car parks were turned into community spaces? So that's home as kind of community rebellion, more open structure. Closed communities. Here we have, a much more insular view, protecting ourselves. So community visas to pass between suburb. Do we have bartering markets making home a place to create and grow products for trade? Home privacy and security tech has gone wild, and the architect follows more community-minded values around protecting spaces for the few on the inside. And of course, that's already a kind of a common way of doing housings in lots of parts of the world. The home bunker, this is where distance and hygiene becomes a design paradigm. So here in the home, we're focusing on safety and hygiene. So utilizing antibacterial materials for buildings, so copper and charcoal, for example. We're minimizing touch, buttons, switches, etc. are no longer something that we have to touch. We design safe spaces of entering and exiting buildings, which is also popular in lots of parts of the world, but is that becoming more of how we look at our house, that there's different sections of the home? And new in-home hedonism. This is my favorite scenario. It's all about maximalism, which is strange coming from somebody who grew up in Stockholm with minimalist design, because here minimalism is thrown out of the window and we prioritize maximum enjoyment. Form, colors is prioritized over functionality. We spend less time focusing on in-home productivity and more time focusing on in-home indulgence. Our homes become kind of sensory hubs for stimulation, creativity, and fun, and we celebrate all those things that makes our home experience stimulating and exciting. And of course, the hospitality industry helps serve all of our needs from our couches. It's not going to be very good for our fitness regime. And then it's time to work out what this all means. Here, we really recommend workshops. So face-to-face or remotely works well as well. bring together people from different backgrounds together to ideate possible implications using creative thinking exercises and activities. So look at the scenarios from all angles of your client's business and open up your thinking. And in the first instance, aim for quantity, just as many ideas, as many ways as you can possibly think of to respond to the different scenarios. Use each scenario as a springboard for thinking and identifying opportunities, or identifying threats as well. Once you've got as many thoughts as possible together, we need to filter and prioritize them. So we've looked at this from 3 pillars, and that's how we usually kind of help focus strategies. So we ask ourselves, is this a cultural reset? So is there a longer term strategy here where we can help create rather than respond to the new normal? Can we help a brand lead the way and be at the forefront of change? Or is it more a formal cultural adaptation? So a more kind of mid-term win that enables a brand to maximize an opportunity. Perhaps there's already brands or products and services that can respond to this scenario if it's just adapted or changed the positioning slightly or the framing of it slightly. Or is it a cultural coma? So a challenge that we need to navigate, to mitigate, to make sure that the brand or products and services aren't becoming obsolete or culturally irrelevant. So then how do we navigate that change? Do we let go of that particular strategy or change it to fit these new circumstances better? And lastly, once everybody are aligned on the scenarios and the strategy, it's really important that everybody in the organization or everybody who's involved in creating change can really empathize and understand these scenarios, and they're embedded within the business. And we often do this through content development and storytelling, so creating films, editorial, it could be prints or digital zines, pen portraits, or beautiful illustrations of the scenarios and how it will affect people to help businesses really understand and empathize with the future, which can be really hard to get people to think about the future, but really bringing them into the future with us is really worthwhile doing to create change. And then just to finish off with this wonderful quote from Ray Hammond, who's written Scary Wonderful, a book about the future. So the more you understand about the likely future, you can shape it as you wish. You might not be able to change the future itself, but you can adjust your own position to take advantage. And that just for me sums up that scenario planning is a way of actually start planning and doing something about the opportunity that might be presented to you in the future, and do something about it. Thank you so much. That's the presentation.
Wonderful, thank you so much. So we've had a few questions come in while you were talking. So someone has said, realistically, how far ahead can trends help us predict what's likely to happen?
That's a really good question. And I think it is really, I should have mentioned that actually, it's really important to decide your time frame. So are you looking 2 to 3 years, 3 to 5, 5 to 10, or 10 plus? So what we would recommend is if you're looking, the further you look ahead, the more you have to keep on refining and adapting your scenarios when new data emerges. So it's not a static thing if you're looking really far ahead in the future. If you're looking beyond 18 months, you can come up with scenarios, but you have to keep on revising them as things change. So you can start kind of getting a picture of what's going to happen in 5 years or 10 years, but you're just going to have to also be open-minded about how the nuance of those scenarios are going to play out.
That makes a lot of sense, thanks. We've had another question. Someone has said, in your view, what brands do cultural scenario planning well and why?
Yeah, it's I actually think that I mean a lot of the kind of the mobility, it's easier if you're a disruptor. So if you're going in with a completely clean slate and you're thinking about and you're coming up with a new product that's going to serve a demand in the future, and you're almost kind of helping to define the zeitgeist. So, you know, electric scooters or, you know, a service app that's completely new. It's a lot easier because you don't have the legacy, but I guess it's more important if you're a business with, you know, FMCG business with loads of brands, lots of products. You might run a bigger risk of some of those brands not feeling relevant or culturally relevant in the future if you don't carry on kind of looking at the future and doing scenario planning. So I think it's kind of, it's easier if you're new in the game, but it's probably more important if you have a, you know, kind of, you're an incumbent or you have a legacy business.
Thank you. Someone else has said, they have said, are there some industry sectors or client types which better lend themselves to this type of approach?
I think you need to be open to the process. I can't typecast industries or brands, but I guess there needs to be an kind of appetite to get involved in the future, and there needs to be champions within that organization who's willing to kind of help everyone get on that journey. I think that's the kind of the biggest important thing, is to kind of get people excited about the future. You know, I said most people, most organizations are future blind, and it's really scary and uncomfortable and a bit weird to think about the future, but anything you can do to get people excited to even just think about the future in a different way, yeah, you run the best chance of succeeding.
Thank you. So we now have a question from Michael Gibson. Michael, are you about?
Yes, hi. Hi, thanks very much for a fascinating and insightful lecture. It's been very eye-opening and fascinating. I'm trying to work with students at the moment on strategic planning, where I do some teaching in Moscow, and you've actually given me some really interesting ideas. So my question is, how do you gain relevant insights for your culture scenarios in different markets with such totally different cultures? I mean, you're in London, you're in Singapore. How do you cope with that?
Yeah, that's a really, really good question, because I think whatever, you know, scenarios won't play out the same way. I think the important thing is to, it's just research. There are no shortcuts. You have to do the research stage. You have to go out and, you know, I mean, you talk to experts, do desk research, and work and do research on the ground. So actually get first-hand information about the cultural science and the behavioral shifts in each market. So typically, you know, we would focus on, you know, the market that our clients are interested in, and we would look at some bigger kind of global macro factors, but also look at cultural shifts in each of the markets that we're focusing on.
Thank you very much.
Thanks so much. I think that is all of the time for questions we have for today. So I'm just going to go ahead and share your screen, share your details on the screen so that people can send you any follow-up questions.
Please do send follow-up questions.
So these are Matilda's details. So I just wanted to say a really big thank you to Dr. Matilda Andersson for that fantastic webinar. As I mentioned, if you didn't have time to ask your question, you can contact Matilda at m.andersson, it's with 2 S's, at crowddna.com. Thank you very much, everyone, for coming. We really hope you enjoyed it. We'll be holding webinars at the same time every Wednesday, and so the next one will be held on the 21st of October, and the title of that webinar is Uncovering Social Media Platforms and Patterns in Southeast Asia, and that will be held by Prerna Pant. So Asia is at the forefront of social media and digital trends, setting the scene for what will be most popular in the West tomorrow. We've called on Circus Social, a social and digital data analytics company from Singapore, to uncover Southeast Asia's pioneering social media platforms and patterns. Circus Social focuses on helping clients enhance and sharpen their digital footprint and specializes in social media intelligence, audience research and insights, and digital monitoring. So if social media and digital expertise are part of your business offering, this is not a webinar to miss. You can find this webinar, the registration information, and all future webinars as well on our website, which is www.thenetwork1.com/webinars. So again, just want to give a really, really big thank you to Dr. Matilda Andersson. Please feel free to follow up with questions, and I hope you'll have a great day and hope to see you at another webinar soon. Thank you. Bye.